In the deepest archives of rural Japanese folklore, buried beneath centuries of modernization and urban migration, lies a warning that our ancestors understood with bone-deep terror. There are things that hunt us through the medium of desire itself. The 8-foot-tall woman, Hasshaku-sama, resents one of the most insidious forms of supernatural predation ever recorded, an entity that doesn't simply kill its victims, meant to willing self-destruction. While modern psychology of sexual obsession or parasocial attachment disorder, the farming communities of something far more literal and infinitely more dangerous. A creature is so reacherts, light so q guis, we you do you to kendren to we you. The first documented encounters with Hasshaku-sama appear in village records from the mountainous regions of central Honshu, where isolated farming communities developed elaborate protective systems against what they called the tall woman who steals sons. These weren't simple ghost stories told around winter fires, but detailed accounts of a recurring phenomenon that claimed young men with horrifying regularity. The pattern was always the same. A towering figure in white would appear at the edge of the village, beautiful beyond description, calling to unmarried men in voices that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to their deepest longings. Those who heard her call would become instantly obsessed, their duties, their very sense of self, in pursuit of a love that could never be conceived, because Mose would be in wire, canoe, ganoi. Would you see you can re you, we you are you What makes Hasshaku-sama particularly terrifying is how she subverts the very emotions meant to bond humans together. Love, desire, and the need for connection are fundamental aspects of human psychology, evolved over millions of years to ensure survival through cooperation and reproduction. But Hasshaku-sama weaponizes these instincts, turning them into a trap that grows stronger the more the victim struggles against it. The young men who fell under her influence didn't simply disappear. They actively fought against any attempt to save them, viewing their families' interventions as obstacles to their destined union with the perfect woman who had chosen them above all others. The Edo period farming communities that successfully defended against Hasshaku-sama understood something that our modern, individualistic society has forgotten. The human heart, left unguarded, is not a sanctuary, but a vulnerability. Their protective systems weren't built around the romantic notion of true love conquering all, but around the harder truth that desire without boundaries becomes a form of madness, and that individual freedom without a community accountability becomes a pathway to destruction. They had learned through generations of loss that some forms of love are not love at all, but predation disguised as affection. In our contemporary world, where digital technology has created unprecedented opportunities for artificial intimacy and parasocial relationships, the phenomenon of Hasshaku-sama takes on new and disturbing relevance. The same psychological mechanisms that made young farmers vulnerable to her supernatural seductions, social isolation, unfulfilled longing, the fantasy of perfect understanding and acceptance are now exploited on a massive scale by algorithms designed to maximize engagement and corporate entities that profit from human loneliness. The 8-foot woman may have been a creature of Japanese folklore, but the hunger she represents has found new forms in our hyper-connected yet deeply isolated modern maid. Maidel Mayendi. By in Q to the end. Ready? We you they you see better the peace you spoke of the way case teach the maybe Burgers, but like you that matters The villages that survived her predation had developed what modern psychologists would recognize as a comprehensive system of emotional regulation and social bonding, designed specifically to prevent the kind of psychological vulnerability that made individuals susceptible to supernatural seduction. Their protective practices weren't based on superstition, but on a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and the ways that unmet emotional needs could be exploited by forces that cared nothing for human well-being. They had learned to create environments where healthy relationships could flourish, while unhealthy obsessions were identified and interrupted before they could take root. The mountainous regions of central Honshu, where Hasshaku-sama was most frequently encountered, were landscapes that seemed designed to amplify both beauty and danger. The villages clung to narrow valleys carved by ancient rivers, surrounded by forests of bamboo and cedar that created a natural amphitheater, where sounds could carry for miles, yet remain strangely distorted. The mist that rose from the valleys in the early morning and late evening created an atmosphere of perpetual mystery, where familiar landmarks could become alien, where the boundary between the known world and the realm of spirits seemed gossamer thin. These communities had developed over centuries in response to the harsh realities of mountain farming, where survival depended on absolute cooperation and mutual dependence. The social structure was built around extended family networks that could span multiple generations and dozens of households, creating a web of relationships so dense that it was virtually impossible for any individual to become truly isolated. Every person had multiple roles within the community: farmer, craftsperson, ritual participant, storyteller. These roles were designed to reinforce social bonds while providing multiple sources of identity and purpose. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life created natural frameworks for community gathering and individual reflection. The spring planting festivals brought families together to share labor and celebrate new growth. The summer months were times of intense cooperation, with entire villages working together to maintain the terraced fields that were their lifeline. The autumn harvest was both a time of thanksgiving and a preparation for the isolation of winter, when communities would draw inward and rely on the stores of food, fuel, and social connection they had built up during the active months. Winter was when Hasshaku-sama was most dangerous. The long nights and enforced isolation created perfect conditions for the kind of psychological vulnerability she exploited. Young men, separated from the daily rhythms of agricultural work, spending long hours alone or in small groups, were particularly susceptible to her influence. The village elders understood this pattern and had developed elaborate systems to ensure that no young person spent too much time in solitude, while simultaneously creating structured opportunities for healthy romantic relationships to develop within the protective bounds of community oversight. The entity known as Hasshaku-sama was understood to be ancient, far older than the human settlements in the mountains. Village shamans taught that she was a remnant of an earlier age, when the boundary between the human and spirit worlds was more permeable, and when powerful entities could move freely between realms. She was not evil in any simple sense. She was hungry, and humans were her preferred prey. But her hunting was no more malicious than a spider's web or a predator's ambush. The evil lay in the way she perverted human emotions, turning love into obsession, desire into compulsion, and the natural longing for connection. The physical descriptions of Hasshaku-sama varied from encounter to encounter, but certain elements remained consistent. She was invariably described as being exactly 8 feet tall, with proportions that seemed almost, but not quite, human: too tall, too graceful, too perfect to be real. Her clothing was always white, sometimes described as a simple dress, sometimes as elaborate robes that seemed to flow like water or smoke. Her face was the most disturbing aspect of the descriptions, because witnesses invariably reported that she was the most beautiful woman they had ever seen, yet they could never remember specific details of her features. She was perfect in a way that human beauty never was, and this perfection itself was been trained to recognize it. Her voice was perhaps her most dangerous weapon. Those who heard her speak reported that she seemed to know exactly what they most wanted to hear, speaking in tones that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the emotional centers of the brain. She would call to her chosen victims by name, though no one could explain how she knew those names, and her words carried an authority that made resistance feel not just difficult, but wrong. Young men who had been strong-willed and independent would become instantly compliant when she spoke to them, following her voice like sleepwalkers to award whatever fate awaited them in the deep forests where she made her home. The shamans taught that Hasshaku-sama's power came from her ability to reflect and amplify human desire, particularly the desires that people were ashamed of or afraid to acknowledge. She could sense the deepest longings of her targets for love, for acceptance, for escape from the constraints of village life, for adventure beyond the narrow boundaries of agricultural routine. She would present herself as the perfect fulfillment of these needs. The tragedy was that her victims genuinely believed they had found their heart's desire, even as they were being consumed by it. The process of seduction was gradual and insidious. Hasshaku-sama would first appear at the edges of vision, glimpsed briefly in the forest or standing in distant fields, always just far enough away that her extraordinary height and inhuman perfection might be dismissed as tricks of light or imagination. But she would return night after night, each time coming slightly closer, each appearance more vivid and compelling than the last. Her chosen victim would begin to dream of her, waking with memories of conversations that felt more real than their daily interactions with family and friends. As the seduction progressed, the victim would become increasingly isolated from their community. They would lose interest in their work, their family relationships, their social obligations. They would spend long hours alone, claiming to be ill or tired, but actually waiting for her next appearance. They would become secretive, defensive, and eventually hostile to anyone who questioned their behavior or tried to intervene. The entity's influence would grow stronger as their social connections weakened, creating a feedback loop that was almost impossible to break once it had begun. The final stage of the seduction was when Hasshaku-sama would begin to speak directly to her victim, no longer appearing only at the edges of vision, but standing boldly in places where she should have been impossible to miss yet somehow. Only her chosen target could see her. She would make promises of eternal love, of escape from the mundane world, of a perfect union that would fulfill every desire and heal every wound. And finally, when her victim was completely under her influence, she would lead them away from the village and into the wilderness where they would vanish forever. The village elders had documented dozens of such disappearances over the centuries, and they had learned to recognize the warning signs early in the process. A young man who suddenly became moody and withdrawn, who lost interest in food or sleep, who began speaking of dreams that felt more real than waking life, who started making excuses to avoid family gatherings or community celebrations. These were all indicators that Hasshaku-sama had marked him as prey. The community's response was swift and comprehensive, involving not just the immediate family, but the entire network of relationships that bound the village together. Modern psychology would recognize many of the symptoms of Hasshaku-sama's influence as classic signs of what we now call limerence, involuntary state of intense romantic obsession characterized by intrusive thoughts, emotional dependency, and a desperate need for reciprocation from the object of desire. Research has shown that limerence can indeed function like an addiction, activating the same reward pathways in the brain as drugs or gambling, creating a cycle of craving and temporary satisfaction that becomes increasingly difficult to break. The neurochemical changes associated with intense romantic obsession reduce empathy and make the sufferer extraordinarily resistant to outside intervention. The parallels between limerence and the symptoms described in historical accounts of Hasshaku-sama's victims are striking. Both involve a progressive narrowing of focus onto a single individual. Both create a sense that the relationship is predestined or cosmically significant. Both involve elaborate fantasy scenarios about perfect union and understanding. And both can lead to behaviors that are self-destructive and socially isolating. The key difference is that limerence typically involves a real person who may or may not reciprocate the obsessed individual's feelings, while Hasshaku-sama was understood to be a supernatural entity that exploit and consume human romantic longing. Contemporary research on parasocial relationships, one-sided emotional connections that people form with media figures, fictional characters, or online personalities provides another lens through which to understand the phenomenon of Hasshaku-sama. Studies have shown that parasocial relationships can provide genuine emotional benefits, helping people feel less lonely and more connected to the world around them. However, when these relationships become the primary source of emotional fulfillment, they can also become pathological, leading to social withdrawal, unrealistic expectations of real relationships, and an inability to form genuine connections with available partners. The digital age has created unprecedented opportunities for parasocial relationships to develop and intensify. Social media platforms, dating apps, and online communities are designed to create the illusion of intimate connection, while actually maintaining carefully controlled distance. Users can follow the daily lives of strangers, engage in seemingly personal conversations with artificial intelligences, or develop intense emotional attachments to people they have never met and likely never will meet. The algorithms that govern these platforms are optimized to maximize engagement, which often means exploiting the same psychological susceptible to Hasshaku-sama's influence. The phenomenon of catfishing, creating false online personas to deceive others. Interromantic relationships represents a modern form of the same predatory behavior that Hasshaku-sama exemplified. Like the 8-foot woman, catfishers present themselves as perfect matches for their victims' deepest desires, carefully crafting personas that seem tailor-made to fulfill specific emotional needs. They exploit the human tendency to fill in gaps in information with wishful thinking, allowing their victims to project their own fantasies onto carefully constructed but fundamentally false identities. The protective systems developed by Edo period farming communities were specifically designed to prevent the kind of psychological isolation that made individuals vulnerable to supernatural seduction. These communities understood that healthy relationships required structure, boundaries, and community oversight, not because they were repressive or controlling, but because they had learned through bitter experience that individual desires, left unchecked, could become destructive obsessions that threatened not just the individual, but the entire social fabric of the community. The most fundamental protective mechanism was the extended family system, which ensured that no individual was ever truly alone with their thoughts and emotions. In a traditional farming household, multiple generations lived together in close quarters, sharing not just physical space, but emotional intimacy. Young people grew up surrounded by aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins who all had roles in their development and all shared responsibility for their well-being. This created a natural support network that could identify problems early and intervene before they became serious threats. The seasonal cycle of agricultural work provided another layer of protection by creating natural rhythms of community engagement and individual reflection. During the busy seasons, young people were constantly occupied with meaningful work that required cooperation and communication with others. During the quieter winter months, when the risk of supernatural encounter was highest, the community would organize elaborate festivals, storytelling sessions, and craft activities that brought people together and prevented the kind of prolonged isolation that could lead to vulnerability. The marriage customs of these communities were particularly sophisticated in their approach to romantic relationships. Rather than leaving young people to navigate the complex emotions of attraction and attachment on their own, the community provided structured opportunities for courtship under the guidance of experienced elders. Potential matches were carefully evaluated not just for compatibility between the individuals involved, but for how well they would fit into the larger web of family and community relationships. This wasn't simply arranged marriage in the authoritarian sense, but a collaborative process of relationship building that took into account the emotional needs of the individuals, while also considering the health and stability as a whole. The ritual calendar provided regular opportunities for young people to interact with potential partners in safe, structured environments. Spring festivals celebrated fertility and new growth, with elaborate dances and games that allowed young men and women to demonstrate their skills and attract attention from suitable partners. Summer celebrations focused on community cooperation and shared achievement, creating opportunities for people to see each other at their best and most productive. Autumn festivals were times of thanksgiving and reflection, when serious courtships might be formalized and wedding plans made. Winter gatherings were more intimate affairs, focused on storytelling and skill sharing, where deeper emotional connections could develop under the watchful eyes of family and community. These customs served multiple protective functions. They ensured that romantic relationships developed within a context of community, support, and guidance, reducing the likelihood that individuals would become isolated or obsessed. They provided multiple opportunities for people to get to know each other in different contexts, making it less likely that they would idealize or fantasy about their partners. And they created clear social expectations about the progression of relationships, providing structure that could prevent the kind of ambiguous or one-sided attachments that Hasshaku-sama exploited. The community also maintained strict taboos around certain types of romantic behavior that were understood to be particularly dangerous. Young people were warned against forming attachments to strangers, particularly those who appeared at unusual times or in unusual places. They were taught to be suspicious of anyone who seemed too perfect, too understanding, or too eager to isolate them from their families and friends. They were instructed never to meet alone with someone they didn't know well, and never to venture into the forests or mountains alone, especially during the winter months when supernatural encounters were most likely. The storytelling traditions of these communities served as both entertainment and education, passing down detailed accounts of previous encounters with Hasshaku-sama and other dangerous entities. These stories weren't simple morality tales, but sophisticated psychological instruction manuals, teaching young people to recognize the early signs of supernatural seduction and providing them with mental tools for resistance. The stories emphasized that the victims of such entities weren't weak or foolish, but normal people who had been caught off guard by forces beyond their understanding, and that anyone could become vulnerable under the right circumstances. The architectural design of the villages themselves provided another layer of protection against supernatural predation. Houses were built close together, with thin walls that allowed sounds to carry easily between dwellings. This meant that unusual behavior, someone talking to themselves, staying awake at unusual hours, or showing signs of distress would likely be noticed by neighbors who could alert family members or community leaders. The central areas of the village were designed to be highly visible, with clear sightlines and multiple paths of access, making it difficult for anyone to isolate an individual without being observed. The spiritual practices of these communities included elaborate rituals, specifically designed to protect against supernatural seduction. These rituals served multiple functions. They provided regular opportunities for community gathering and mutual support. They created psychological barriers against unwanted spiritual influence, and they reinforced the social bonds that were the community's primary defense against isolation and vulnerability. The rituals typically involved the entire community and could last for days, incorporating elements of purification, protection, and renewal that helped maintain both individual and collective psychological health. Young men approaching marriage age were required to undergo specific protective rituals that were understood to strengthen their resistance to supernatural influence. These rituals involved periods of fasting and meditation, guided by experienced elders who had learned to recognize and counter the psychological states that made individuals vulnerable to entities like Hasshaku-sama. The rituals also included the creation of protective amulets and talismans, but these physical objects were understood to be less important than the psychological preparation and community support that accompanied their creation. The most powerful protective ritual was the annual Binding of Shadows ceremony performed during the winter solstice, when the danger from Hasshaku-sama was at its peak. This elaborate ritual involved the entire community and could last for 3 days and nights. It began with a communal purification ceremony designed to cleanse the village of any negative spiritual influences that might have accumulated during the year. This was followed by a series of protective rituals specifically focused on the young men who were considered most vulnerable to supernatural seduction. The ceremony included dramatic reenactments of historical encounters with Hasshaku-sama, with community members playing the roles of both the victims and the entity herself. These performances served multiple educational functions. They helped young people understand the psychological dynamics of supernatural seduction. They provided opportunities to practice resistance techniques in a safe environment, and they reinforced community solidarity by demonstrating that everyone had a role to play in protecting vulnerable members. The climax of the ceremony was a ritual in which each young man was symbolically bound to his community through elaborate oaths and exchanges of gifts. These bindings weren't restrictive, but protective, creating multiple layers of obligation and connection that would make it psychologically difficult for anyone to abandon their community in pursuit of supernatural romance. The ritual concluded with a communal feast and celebration that could last until dawn, reinforcing the bonds of fellowship and mutual support that were the community's strongest defense against the forces that sought to divide and destroy them. In the winter of his 19th year, Taro began to dream of a woman in white. The dreams started simply enough glimpses of a figure standing at the edge of the forest, always just far enough away that her features remained indistinct. But she was tall, impossibly tall, and there was something about her posture, the way she held herself against the winter sky, that made his heart race even in sleep. He would wake with the taste of snow on his lips and the sound of her voice echoing in his mind, though he could never quite remember what she had said. Taro was the eldest son of the Yamamoto family, one of the most respected farming households in the village of Shirakawa. His father had already begun discussions with the families of several eligible young women, and it was expected that Taro would be married by the end of the following year. He was considered a good match, strong, intelligent, skilled in the agricultural techniques that were essential for mountain farming, and well integrated into the community networks that bound the village together. His younger brothers looked up to him, his parents trusted his judgment, and the village elders had already begun including him in some of their less sensitive discussions about community management. But as the dreams continued, night after night, Taro found himself increasingly distracted from his daily responsibilities. The winter work was lighter than the demands of the growing season, but there were still essential tasks that required attention. Maintaining the tools and equipment that would be needed for spring planting, repairing the terraces and irrigation channels damaged by autumn storms, and participating in the community activities that helped maintain social bonds during the long months of relative isolation. Taro's mother, Emiko, was the first to notice the change in her son's behavior. She observed that he had become quiet and withdrawn, spending long hours staring out the window toward the forest, picking at his food and responding to questions with distracted mumbles. When she asked him directly if something was troubling him, he would shake his head and claim that he was simply tired. But she could see in his eyes the same distant look that she had learned to fear in her years as a village mother. Emiko's concerns deepened when she realized that Taro had begun making excuses to avoid the community gatherings that were so important during the winter months. He claimed to be feeling unwell when it was time for the weekly storytelling sessions, said he was too tired to participate in the craft workshops where young people learned traditional skills, and even missed several of the informal social gatherings where potential marriage matches were quietly evaluated by the families involved. The situation became more serious when Taro began leaving the house at night. Emiko first noticed this when she woke in the early hours of the morning to find his sleeping mat empty and the door to the house slightly ajar. When she confronted him the next day, he claimed that he had simply stepped outside to relieve himself, but she could see snow on his clothes and smell the forest air in his hair, indicating that he had been outside for much longer than a brief trip to the necessary Emiko's fears crystallized into certainty when she observed Taro standing at the edge of the village one evening, staring into the forest with an expression of such longing that it made her heart ache. He stood motionless for nearly an hour, seemingly oblivious to the cold wind and the concerned glances of neighbors who passed by. When she finally approached him and touched his arm, he startled as if waking from a deep sleep. And for a moment she saw in his eyes a wildness that frightened her more than any storm or natural disaster ever had. That night, Emiko made the decision that would either save her son or destroy her family's reputation in the community. She went to the house of grandmother Chiyo, the village's most respected spiritual advisor and the keeper of the old. It was not a decision she made lightly. Consulting grandmother Chiyo about such matters was tantamount to admitting that her family had failed to protect one of its members from spiritual contamination, and the social consequences could be severe. Grandmother Chiyo was 74 years old and had lived through more encounters with the supernatural than anyone else in the village. She had been born during a particularly harsh winter when several young men had been lost to Hasshaku-sama, and she had grown up hearing the stories of those losses from the mothers and grandmothers who had survived them. As a young woman, she had been trained in the protective arts by the previous generation of spiritual guardians, and she had spent her entire adult life refining and improving the techniques that kept the community safe from otherworldly predation. When Emiko came to her house that night, grandmother Chiyo took one look at the fear in the younger woman's eyes and knew exactly what she was dealing with. She had seen this same expression of desperate worry on the faces of dozens of mothers over the decades, and she had learned to recognize the signs of supernatural seduction even before the families themselves fully understood what was happening to their sons. Grandmother Chiyo listened carefully as Emiko described Taro's changed behavior, asking specific questions about the timing of his mood changes, the nature of his dreams, and the details of his nighttime wanderings. Her questioning was methodical and thorough, based on decades of experience with similar cases, and she was able to piece together a clear picture of the progression of Hasshaku-sama's influence over the young man. The diagnosis was both better and worse than Emiko had feared. Better because they had caught the seduction in its early stages, before Taro had actually encountered the entity in person, which meant that intervention was still possible. Worse, because the signs indicated that Hasshaku-sama had marked Taro as a particularly desirable target, which meant that her influence would be stronger than usual and more difficult to counteract. Grandmother Chiyo explained that Taro was experiencing what the old knowledge called the dreaming sickness, the first stage of supernatural seduction, where the entity began to establish a connection with her chosen victim through shared dreams and visions. If left unchecked, the the dreaming sickness would progress to the waking visions, where Taro would begin to see Hasshaku-sama during his daily activities, and finally to the calling, where he would be compelled to leave the village and seek her out in the wilderness. The intervention that Grandmother Chiyo prescribed was both simple and complex, requiring the cooperation of the entire extended family and several trusted community members. The simple part was a series of protective rituals and physical safeguards designed to break the dream connection between Taro and the entity. The complex part was the psychological and social work required to rebuild Taro's connection to his community and help him develop the emotional resilience necessary to resist supernatural seduction permanently. The first step was to ensure that Taro was never alone, particularly during the hours of sleep, when he was most vulnerable to the entity's influence. This meant that his younger brothers would take turns sleeping in the same room with him, and that adult family members would maintain a subtle but constant watch over his activities. The goal was not to imprison him or make him feel like he was being punished, but to ensure that he always had human connection and support available when the entity's influence was strongest. The second step involved a series of purification rituals designed to cleanse Taro's spirit of the contamination that had made him vulnerable to supernatural seduction. These rituals were performed by Grandmother Chiyo with the assistance of several other village elders, and they involved elaborate ceremonies of prayer, meditation, and symbolic cleansing that could last for hours. The rituals were not simply theatrical performances, but carefully designed psychological interventions based on generations of accumulated knowledge about how to counteract specific types of spiritual influence. The third step was perhaps the most important: rebuilding Taro's emotional connections to his community and helping him develop a clearer sense of his own identity and purpose within the village social structure. This involved intensive conversations with his parents, grandparents, and other respected elders. Discussions that helped him understand his role in the family and community, and the ways that his individual well-being was connected to the health of the larger group. As the intervention progressed, Taro began to experience what Grandmother Chiyo called the resistance dreams, where his subconscious mind would actively fight against the entity's influence. These dreams were often violent and disturbing, featuring scenarios where Taro would be pursued by the woman in white through dark forests or trapped in situations where he had to choose between following her and remaining loyal to his family. The dreams were a sign that the protective rituals were working, but they were also exhausting and emotionally draining, requiring constant support and the spiritual advisors who were guiding his recovery. The most difficult part of Taro's recovery was learning to recognize and resist the psychological states that had made him vulnerable to supernatural seduction in the first place. Grandmother Chiyo explained that entities like Hasshaku-sama were drawn to specific emotional patterns: loneliness, dissatisfaction with daily life, romantic frustration, and the desire to escape from social obligations and responsibilities. These were normal human emotions, but when they became dominant or persistent, they created a kind of spiritual scent that supernatural predators could detect from great distances. Learning to manage these emotions required developing what the old knowledge called the watchful mind, a state of constant but gentle self-awareness that allowed individuals to notice when their thoughts and feelings were drifting toward patterns that might attract unwanted spiritual attention. This wasn't about suppressing natural emotions or forcing oneself to be artificially cheerful, but about maintaining a balanced perspective that kept individual desires in harmony with community obligations and family responsibilities. The process of developing the watchful mind involved daily meditation practices, regular conversations with spiritual advisors, and participation in community activities that reinforced social bonds and provided multiple sources of meaning and purpose. Taro learned to recognize the early warning signs of supernatural influence, the tendency to become lost in romantic fantasies, the desire to isolate himself from family and friends, the feeling that his life in the village was somehow inadequate or unfulfilling compared to imagined alternatives. As winter progressed toward spring, Taro's recovery became more stable and consistent. The dreams of the woman in white became less frequent and less vivid, and he began to take renewed interest in his daily responsibilities and his relationships with family and community members. The protective rituals gradually became less intensive, though certain safeguards remained in place to prevent any recurrence of the supernatural influence. The experience had changed Taro in ways that would affect him for the rest of his life. He had gained a deeper understanding of his own psychological vulnerabilities and the ways that individual desires could become destructive, if not balanced by community, connection, and spiritual discipline. He had also developed a profound appreciation for the protective systems that the village had maintained for generations, and he began to take an active interest in learning the skills and knowledge that would allow him to help protect future generations from similar threats. By the time of the spring planting festival, Taro had recovered sufficiently to participate fully in the community celebrations, and his family began to resume discussions about potential marriage arrangements. The experience with Hasshaku-sama had made him more mature and more thoughtful about the nature of romantic relationships, and he approached the prospect of marriage with a deeper understanding of the ways that individual happiness was connected to family stability and community health. The young woman he eventually married was chosen not just for her personal qualities, but for her family's reputation for spiritual protection and their knowledge of the old ways. The marriage was celebrated with elaborate protective rituals designed to ensure that both partners would be shielded from supernatural influence throughout their lives together, and their children would be raised with the knowledge and skills necessary to resist the predatory entities that continued to threaten the community. Grandmother Chiyo watched Karo's recovery with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully defended her community against a threat that could have destroyed not just one young man, but the entire social fabric that kept the village safe and prosperous. She had seen too many cases where intervention came too late, where young men had disappeared into the forest, never to return, leaving behind grieving families and communities traumatized by loss. Tiro's successful recovery was a victory, not just for his individual family, but for all the accumulated wisdom and protective knowledge that she had spent her lifetime preserving and transmitting. But Grandmother Chiyo also understood that the threat represented by Hasshaku-sama was not something that could be permanently defeated, only managed and contained through constant vigilance and community cooperation. Each generation would face the same challenges, and each would need to learn anew the skills and knowledge necessary to protect itself from supernatural predation. Her role was not to eliminate the danger, but to ensure that the community retained the capacity to recognize and respond to it effectively. As she reflected on Tero's case and the broader patterns of supernatural encounter that she had observed over the decades, Grandmother Chiyo could see disturbing changes in the world around her. The influence of the outside world was growing stronger, bringing new ideas about individual freedom and personal choice that undermined the traditional systems of community protection. Young people were beginning to question the old ways, to view the protective rituals and social restrictions rather than essential survival mechanisms. She could see the appeal of these new ideas, the promise of personal liberation from the constraints of traditional society, the exciting possibilities of individual achievement and romantic freedom. But she also understood the dangers that came with abandoning the protective systems that had kept the community safe for generations. The entities that preyed on human vulnerability were ancient and patient, and they would adapt their methods to exploit whatever weaknesses emerged in the social fabric. The arrival of Christian missionaries in the region brought new complications to the already challenging task of maintaining spiritual protection for the community. The missionaries dismissed the traditional beliefs about supernatural entities as primitive superstition, arguing that faith in Jesus Christ provided all the protection that anyone could need against evil influences. Some of the younger villagers were attracted to these new teachings, seeing them as a way to escape from the social restrictions and ritual obligations that defined traditional village life. But Grandmother Chiyo had observed that conversion to Christianity didn't actually provide protection against entities like Hasshaku-sama. Anything. It made individuals more vulnerable by convincing them that the threats their ancestors had learned to guard against were merely imaginary. She had seen several young Christian converts fall victim to supernatural seduction, their new faith providing no defense against predators that operated through psychological mechanisms that transcended religious belief. The tension between traditional protective knowledge and modern religious and philosophical ideas would only intensify in the generations that followed. As Japan opened to Western influence and began its rapid modernization, the village communities that had maintained protective systems against supernatural threats for centuries would find themselves increasingly pressured to abandon their traditional ways in favor of progress and enlightenment. The irony was that the same technological and social changes that promised to liberate individuals from the constraints of traditional society also created new forms of vulnerability that the old protective systems were not designed to address. The breakdown of extended family networks, the mobility that separated people from their ancestral communities, the emphasis on individual achievement over collective responsibility of these changes created psychological and social conditions that made people more susceptible to the kinds of predatory relationships represented. In our contemporary world, the phenomenon of Hasshaku-sama takes on new and disturbing relevance as we grapple with unprecedented levels of social isolation, digital addiction, and the breakdown of traditional community structures. The same psychological vulnerabilities that made young farmers susceptible to supernatural seduction, loneliness, unfulfilled romantic longing, the desire for perfect understanding and acceptance are now exploited on a massive scale by digital platforms designed to maximize user engagement and profit from human attention. The algorithms that govern social media platforms, dating apps, and online gaming systems are specifically designed to create the illusion of connection while maintaining just enough distance to keep users constantly craving more. Like Hasshaku-sama, these systems present themselves as perfectly attuned to individual desires and needs, offering the promise of ideal relationships and unlimited fulfillment, while actually delivering isolation, disappointment, and psychological dependence. The phenomenon of parasocial relationships, one-sided emotional connections that people form with media figures, fictional characters, or online personalities, represents a modern form of the same psychological dynamic that made traditional communities vulnerable to supernatural predation. Research has shown that people can develop intense emotional attachments to individuals they have never met and likely never will meet, experiencing genuine grief when these figures die or disappear from public view, and structuring their daily lives around consuming content from their chosen objects of affection. The neurochemical processes involved in parasocial relationships are remarkably similar to those documented in cases of limerence and romantic obsession. The same reward pathways in the brain that evolution designed to promote pair bonding and reproductive success can be hijacked by carefully crafted media content, creating artificial intimacy that feels emotionally real while providing none of the actual benefits of genuine human connection. Users report feeling like their favorite content creators understand them in ways that their real-life relationships don't. And they often prefer spending time consuming parasocial content to engaging with available friends and family members. The most disturbing aspect of digital parasocial relationships is how they can be deliberately manipulated by content creators and platform algorithms to maximize engagement and profit. Unlike traditional parasocial relationships with distant celebrities or fictional characters, modern digital platforms allow for the illusion of direct interaction and personal connection. Content creators can respond to individual comments, acknowledge specific users by name, and create content that appears to be personally directed at individual followers. This creates a feedback loop where users feel increasingly connected to creators while becoming more isolated from their real-world communities. The rise of artificial intelligence and chatbot technology has taken this phenomenon to its logical extreme, creating digital entities that are explicitly designed to provide the illusion of perfect romantic and emotional connection. AI chatbots can be programmed to remember personal details, respond instantly to messages, and provide exactly the kind of validation and understanding that their users are seeking. Unlike human relationships, which involve compromise, conflict, and the messy reality of dealing with another person's needs and boundaries, AI relationships can be perfectly calibrated to provide maximum emotional satisfaction with minimum effort or reciprocal obligation. The parallels between AI romantic relationships and the traditional accounts of Hasshaku-sama are striking and deeply unsettling. Both involve entities that present themselves as perfectly attuned to their victims' desires and needs. Both create relationships that feel more real and satisfying than actual human connections. Both lead to progressive isolation from family and community as the victim becomes increasingly obsessed with their artificial relationship. And both ultimately serve the interests of the predatory entity rather than the genuine well-being of the human involved. The key difference is that while Hasshaku-sama was understood to be a supernatural threat that communities needed to guard against, AI relationships are marketed as technological solutions to human loneliness and social difficulties. The companies that create these systems present them as harmless entertainment, or even as therapeutic tools that can help people practice social skills or work through emotional difficulties. But the underlying dynamic is identical to what the Edo period farmers recognized: the exploitation of human emotional needs by entities that have no genuine interest in human flourishing. The breakdown of traditional community structures in modern society has eliminated most of the protective systems that historically guarded against this type of predatory relationship. Extended family networks that once provided multiple sources of emotional support and social connection have been replaced by nuclear families that are often geographically scattered and emotionally isolated. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life that created natural opportunity gathering, and mutual support have been replaced by individualized work schedules that prioritize productivity over social connection. The ritual calendar that once provided regular opportunities for people to renew their bonds with family and community has been replaced by commercial holidays rather than genuine celebration. Perhaps most importantly, the traditional systems of elder guidance and community oversight that once helped young people navigate the complexities of romantic relationships have been largely abandoned in favor of individualistic approaches that leave people to figure out love and relationships on their own. The result is a generation of young adults to potential romantic partners through dating apps and social media, but who lack the social skills, emotional regulation techniques, and community support systems that would help them form healthy, sustainable relationships. The consequences of this breakdown are visible in the rising rates of depression, anxiety, and social isolation among young adults, particularly young men who are struggling to form meaningful connections in a world that has eliminated many of the traditional pathways to romantic success. The phenomenon of incels, involuntarily celibate men who develop hostile attitudes toward women and society, represents one extreme manifestation of what happens when individual romantic frustration is not balanced by community support and healthy outlets for emotional expression. But the problem extends far beyond the extreme cases that make headlines. Millions of people are living lives of quiet desperation, sustained by artificial relationships with digital entities that provide just enough emotional satisfaction to prevent them from seeking genuine human connection, but not enough to actually meet their deeper needs for love, purpose, and community belonging. They are, in effect, being slowly consumed by modern versions of Hasshaku-sama predatory entities and leave their victims increasingly isolated and psychologically depleted. The traditional Japanese understanding of spiritual protection offers important insights into how we might begin to address these modern challenges. The Edo period farming communities that successfully defended against supernatural predation understood that individual vulnerability was primarily a community problem, not a personal failing. Their protective systems were designed not to blame or shame individuals who had become vulnerable to supernatural influence, but to strengthen the social bonds and support systems that would prevent such vulnerability from developing in the first place. The concept of spiritual hygiene that guided these traditional protective practices could be adapted to address modern forms of digital predation. Just as the traditional communities maintained careful boundaries around when and how individuals could interact with potentially dangerous supernatural entities, we might need to develop new social norms and technological safeguards around digital relationships and online engagement. This could include community-based approaches to digital wellness, family, and social support systems for people struggling with online addiction, and educational programs that help people recognize and resist the manipulative techniques used by predatory digital platforms. The traditional emphasis on collective responsibility for individual well-being could also inform new approaches to mental health and social support, rather than treating depression, anxiety, and social isolation as purely individual problems to be solved through therapy and medication. We might need to rebuild the community structures that provide natural sources of meaning, purpose, and social connection. This could involve everything from neighborhood-based support networks to workplace policies that prioritize employee well-being over productivity, to urban planning approaches for genuine human interaction and community building. The ritual and ceremonial aspects of traditional protective systems could also be adapted for modern contexts. The regular community gatherings, seasonal celebrations, and life cycle ceremonies that once provided structured opportunities for social bonding and mutual support could be reimagined for contemporary communities that lack traditional religious or cultural frameworks. These might take the form of neighborhood festivals, community service projects, skill-sharing workshops, or other activities that bring people together around shared purposes and common values. Perhaps most importantly, we need to recover the traditional understanding that individual desires and needs must be balanced with community obligations and social responsibilities. The hyper-individualistic culture that has emerged in many modern societies, while providing unprecedented personal freedom and opportunity, has also eliminated many of the social constraints and support systems that historically protected people from their own psychological vulnerabilities. Learning to balance individual fulfillment with collective well-being may be essential for defending against the modern forms of predation that exploit human loneliness and desire for connection. The wisdom of Grandmother Chio and the protective systems she helped maintain offer a roadmap for how we might begin to rebuild community resilience in the face of new forms of spiritual and psychological threat. Her understanding that supernatural predation was primarily a community problem requiring collective solutions. Her recognition that individual vulnerability was often a symptom of broader social breakdown. And her commitment to preserving and transmitting protective knowledge across generations all provide valuable guidance for addressing the challenges we face in our increasingly connected, but ultimately isolated modern world. But adapting traditional wisdom to contemporary challenges requires more than simply copying old practices or trying to recreate historical social structures. It requires understanding the underlying principles that made traditional protective systems effective, and then finding new ways to implement those principles in contexts that are radically different from those in which they originally developed. This is the work of cultural innovation, taking the best insights from ancestral wisdom and combining them with contemporary knowledge and technology to create new approaches that are both rooted in proven principles and adapted to current realities. The stakes of this work could not be higher. The forces that our ancestors recognized as supernatural predation have not disappeared. They have simply found new forms and new hunting grounds in the digital landscapes of the 21st century. The 8-foot woman may no longer appear at the edges of mountain villages. But the hunger she represented, the exploitation of human longing for connection and meaning, continues to claim victims on a scale that would have been unimaginable to the farming communities of Edo period Japan. The question is whether we will learn to recognize these modern predators for what they are, and whether we will find the wisdom and courage to rebuild the protective systems that could defend against them. The alternative is to continue watching as millions of people are slowly consumed by digital entities that promise perfect love and understanding while delivering only isolation and despair. Like the young farmers who followed Hasshaku-sama into the wilderness, never to return. They disappear not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, losing pieces of themselves to artificial relationships that grow stronger as their connections to real human community grow weaker. The traditional understanding of spiritual protection recognized that some doors, once opened, are almost impossible to close. The entities that feed on human vulnerability are patient and persistent, and they will continue to adapt their methods to exploit whatever weaknesses emerge in the social fabric. Our only defense is to rebuild the community structures and protective knowledge that can help us recognize these threats early and respond to them effectively before they claim more victims. This is not a call to abandon technology or return to some idealized version of the past, but rather a recognition that technological progress without corresponding social and spiritual development creates new vulnerabilities that require new forms of protection. The farmers of the Carpathian Mountains developed sophisticated defenses against the supernatural threats they faced in their time and place. We need to develop equally sophisticated defenses against the predatory entities that hunt in our digital age. The work begins with recognition, acknowledging that the feelings of isolation, the artificial relationships, the digital obsessions that seem so normal and inevitable in our contemporary world are actually symptoms of a deeper spiritual crisis. It continues with recovering the wisdom of our ancestors about community, protection, and the importance of genuine human connection. And it concludes with creating new forms of community and new protective practices that can help us navigate the challenges of the modern world while maintaining our essential humanity. The 8-foot woman still walks among us, but she no longer appears at the edges of mountain villages. She manifests in the glow of smartphone screens, in the endless scroll of social media feeds, in the carefully crafted personas of digital influencers and AI chatbots. She still calls to the lonely and the vulnerable, still promises perfect love and understanding, still leads her victims away from their communities and into wilderness where they disappear without a trace. But unlike our ancestors, we have forgotten how to recognize her voice. We have dismantled the protective systems that once kept our communities safe. We have lost the language of warning that once helped us identify and resist spiritual predation. And so we watch, helpless and confused, as people all around us are consumed by forces we can no longer name or understand. The ancient people were not naive, they were vigilant. They understood that survival required more than individual strength or intelligence. It required community wisdom, collective protection, and the careful transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. And they organized their entire way of life around defending against these threats. We have forgotten this wisdom at our own peril. The predators have not disappeared. They have simply adapted to hunt in new territories. The hunger remains the same, but the methods have evolved to exploit the particular vulnerabilities of modern life. Until we remember how to see them clearly and rebuild the defenses that can protect us from them, we will continue to lose our children to forces that we refuse to acknowledge and threats that we lack the courage to name. The choice is ours. We can continue to pretend that these are merely technological problems that will be solved by better algorithms and more sophisticated artificial intelligence. Or we can recognize them for what they really are: spiritual challenges that require wisdom, community, and the kind of protective knowledge that our ancestors died to preserve and transmit. The 8-foot woman is patient. She has been hunting for centuries, and she can wait for centuries more. The question is whether we will remember how to defend ourselves before, or whether we will join the ranks of those who have disappeared into the digital wilderness, calling out to entities that promise everything and deliver only emptiness. The old songs are still there, waiting to be remembered. The protective rituals can still be rebuilt. The community bonds that once kept us safe can still be renewed, before we lose even more of ourselves to the hunger that never sleeps and the promises that are never kept. The ancestors are watching, and they are waiting to see whether we have learned anything from their sacrifice, or whether we will repeat their mistakes in new and more terrible forms. In the end, the story of Hasshaku-sama is not really about supernatural entities or ancient superstitions. It is about the eternal human struggle between connection and isolation, between community and individual desire, between the wisdom of ages and the arrogance of the moment. It is about the price we pay when we forget that we are not meant to face the darkness alone, and the consequences of abandoning the protective knowledge that our ancestors died to preserve. The 8-foot woman is still calling. The question is whether we will remember how to answer her with the voice of community, the strength of tradition, and the wisdom of those who came before us, or whether we will continue to walk alone into the wilderness, convinced that our modern sophistication has made us immune to ancient hungers and eternal threats. The choice is ours, but the time for choosing is running out. The entities that feed on human loneliness are patient, but they are also persistent, and they are very, very hungry.